So here we are. I'm coming in to wrap up my January reads. January was one of the worst reading months that I've had in quite some time. I do think it was mainly led by the fact that I did finish up Shadows Upon Time in December, which was the final book 7 of the Sun Eater series, which is my favorite series I've ever read. It's really hard for me to pick up after that point to like commit to new series or series I've already started that everything has to try and live up to my favorite thing I've ever read. So January I really struggled overall. So I did have reads that now that I look back on were still really good, or there was one that I didn't like as much, but it's so hard for me to compare and find those like anything that relates to a 5-star read after that series, but we're here to wrap those up. So the first read I had in January was The Winter King, Bernard Cornwell. This book is an Arthurian legend retelling. It's from the point of view of not Arthur, but someone who's sort of within his sort of scope, within his, I guess, like army, squad, whatever you want to call it. And it is in a framed narrative, so he is telling it to someone else. That's like how the narration's happening, so it kind of breaks the point where he's like, you find out that he's like the person telling the story is much older and he's living as like sort of a priest monk sort of deal there and telling the whole story. I gave this book 4 stars. Bernard Cornwell also lives on Cape Cod, where I'm from, so that's kind of cool. But he's known for all of these historical fiction books. I would call this historical fiction, despite there is like some magic involved with Merlin, but it very much feels like a historical fiction book. I found it really good. There are points where it definitely lags behind just because you're not in Arthur's point of view. So like you see what is going on with Arthur, or you know what's going on with Arthur, but you're kind of stuck with this character and what he's going through that doesn't always necessarily relate to like what's going on with Arthur. So you kind of feel like, oh, I'm in the thick of it. This is like really interesting, and then it kind of steps away, and this character is just away from Arthur for a period of time, which I did find slightly annoying, but I did learn to love the main character more and more throughout it. I would say this is like every trigger warning. It's very dark book, and it is a fun overall read, but there were points in time where I was like, this is kind of beating me up a little bit. And it's also like when you're reading something like historical fiction that's really into like the dark ages, like how they speak is a little crazy, and also like the spacings in the book. This is like just a big complaint of mine with any book like this. There aren't really defined chapters, it just kind of goes, which I'm not a huge fan of. But overall, you follow this whole story and there's like multiple different arcs. The entire time you feel like, I think I came to the end of being like, I would kill for this King Arthur character. He seems like the best of people that's ever existed, which was very cool. I don't know anything about King Arthur. That's just a sort of scope of knowledge or whatever you want to call it that I have just no concept of whatsoever. And this was really cool to step into, just not knowing how it ends. Like, spoiler, King Arthur dies, like anyone dies, but I don't know how it happens, so like I don't have that level of spoiler involved. I just know like the Arthurian legend ends when he dies, but I don't know why, I don't know how it happens. And there's a lot of cool nuance of characters. There's also like the main character's telling the story, but the person he's telling the story to has their already like developed preconceived notions of what happened or like what the lore is. He's like, no, that's actually not true, and this is why, this is what happened, this is my relationship to this. So it feels very personal and it reads as someone like telling you a story, which is really cool when he builds in the context of like, this is what you thought, even though like I don't think those things because I don't know Arthurian stuff, but he's telling that to the person he's talking to, which I found very enjoyable. I am planning on continuing this, but it's not in the realm of 4 stars where I'm like, I gotta get this right on the list. I do plan on reading other Cronwell books. I did just recently buy the Last Kingdom, which is the first book of the Last Kingdom series. There's a Netflix show on that, which I've seen a season or 2 of. Not a huge TV person, but I'm excited to read that as well. I'll probably read The Last Kingdom book 1 before I read the second book in the Arthurian Winter King series. The second book that I did read was a sort of like buddy read with my wife, which we've never done before at all. But this book I had been recommended to by some coworkers, as well as like I've just heard a bunch about it, even despite it being in the like sort of romantasy realm, which I don't ever read at all. But my wife had already bought this book and she had never read it and she wanted to read it, so that's One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This book I very much disliked. There are things about it that I thought were cool and interesting, but I didn't care. That was my biggest thing, is I just really didn't care. The main character, I didn't feel very attached to. Like, she didn't have a real defined personality besides that she was kind of like an outsider because of she had this sort of like disease, for lack of a better term, without like spoiling what was going on. And my biggest issue, which this kind of might speak to the specific like plot and genre, and I guess like maybe not genre is the word, but the specific time frame that it European style fantasy frames itself into, is she's a woman and there's a lot of like courting system. I think my wife said it best, where she said that it's like Bridgerton-esque, where there's like courting and like there's these balls and things like that. The main character is living in a world similar to like, I guess, the Bridgerton style, where she didn't have the opportunity to make her own decisions. And I really didn't like following a main character who just kind of went along for the ride. Like, there were all these decisions where they were being led by like the secondary or like the romantic character. Like, she didn't feel like she made a decision until literally the absolute end of the book, and that was like the big climax. And it was like, she didn't earn these she didn't earn the consequences of her own choices. She earned the consequences of other people's choices that she was like entangled with, which I really hated. I didn't like being stuck with a character who didn't have their own sort of autonomy with their own choices until the very end, and her choice wasn't based on what she was going through. It was based on to help others, where she had not helped herself once throughout the entire book. She had just kind of been stuck in the situation and had to follow. And everyone was against her. She didn't really have like really true allies that were her allies for her. Now, the positives, if you are like, I'm interested in this book, it does have a really cool magic system. I do think that worked really well. It's very tarot card based, or I guess not very, it literally is, where these cards do specific magical actions and they affect people differently, but there are consequences behind them. I do think the magic system and the world were built out quite well. It was just not for me in the sense of the actual characters, and that just took me out of the story completely, and I very much was not a fan. The third book I read in January was A Betrayal in Winter by Daniel Abraham. This is the second book in the Long Price Quartet. Shout out Thrift Books. Got the first 3 of these 4 for all like $2 in great condition. So I read I believe it was in December. I think it was early December. I read the Price of Spring, and that is no. Yes, I think that's what it is. Price of Spring, something like that. That's the first book in this series. It's the Long Price Quartet. To sell the series as a whole, it is a Asian-inspired fantasy story. So the names are Asian-based. There's a lot of non-verbal communication, but it's described in the first book. I would say that's probably the one deterrent of the first book is it's heavily and they took a stance of confirmation or apology. They very much describe how Daniel Abraham very much describes how the specific way someone stands or their posture communicates, which was very interesting. I would say there's 10 to 15% too much of that in the first book, which you get adjusted to about halfway through. And I will say these are epic fantasy 4 books, but this one in the pocket-sized mass market paperback is under 350 pages. The first one was even shorter. What this story does really well is makes you fall in love or hate characters for their specific personality, their specific actions. It's not entirely based around the grand scale of the world. It's significantly more on how they interact with each other. So the entire story is based around Mati and Ota, who are the main 2 characters. In the book 1, they're 16, 17, and they are living in Sadaket, which is a very sunny city, and they're involved with they end up in the same city, and they get sort of entangled in this whole political drama in book 1. And that political drama, they're not in power. They're very much sort of side characters, if you were going to call, they're not the kings or anything like that, but they're tangentially involved in these huge events that change their entire city's sort of timeline and what's going to happen next. They are involved in what affects the economy, the world, how everything is being shaped. And then at the end of the book, they separate. And in Betrayal Winter, they are away from each other. It is about 13 years later, so I believe they're 30 at this point in time. Round number. Ota is, I think, a year or 2 older than Mati. Not a huge deal here. So what's happening in this one is they're separated, and a big sort of new political thing happens, and they end up being rejoined in a different area. I do think without spoiling, this is obviously a book 2, I do think what this book does so well is it talks about, it highlights sort of sexism and the view within this scope, obviously in fantasy, and it's a very patriarchal sort of system in this entire world, extreme, where what really highlights, and once you get to this book, it's not a spoiler, you find this out very early, but the villain is a woman, and she's pulling all the strings, where she's kind of forced into the situation to get the life that she wants and she believes that she deserves, and she sort of manipulates these situations, and everyone's could not even consider a woman could think like this or take these actions or be responsible of this, because they just kind of view her as to the side and as nothing. She is very clearly entangled, very clearly involved in all of this political drama, the deaths, like everything that's going on, and everyone just goes like, well, she just got stuck here. It's not like she's involved. And she's like openly like not hiding it very well. Like people have figured out the whole scheme, but will just be like, well, it can't be her. And it was a very interesting way to frame like the struggle of being a powerful woman, but in the sense of title without having the power of action and control of their life. I found that very, very well done, and the characters were very beautifully done. And one thing I will say about Daniel Abraham in this series is characters earn what they get, and he doesn't pull them into like save the day, sort of like, oh, it all ties up nicely. It ties up exactly how it should go for a lot of these characters, and it's extremely well done. This was as close to a 5-star without being a 5-star for me, just because I liked the first one better. So it was a slight disappointment, and it wasn't a fault of the characters. It was just I really enjoyed the place Sadaket in the first book. It performed so well as an extra sort of environment and character in itself. It very much, the first book felt like a sort of like Venice to me. Like it felt flowing, and like there's water, it's sunshine, but there's a city there and everyone's kind of sneaking around. Where this one felt like almost trapped inside which it's called a betrayal in winter, but it felt very trapped inside like cold, dark buildings. You didn't feel the environment anywhere as near as much as the first book. That's probably the only negative I have about this book is the ambiance, which is a crazy thing to say about a book, but that's how I felt.